very good evening, good morning, and good afternoon, depending on which part of the world you're joining us from. We are welcoming you to another edition of the seminar and lecture series at the School of Arts and Sciences. I'm Sarthak Bagchi. I teach here at the School of Arts and Sciences and also convene the seminar and lecture series. And we are very pleased to invite you for a very exciting and a very interesting lecture by Professor Michael Wilson, about whom my colleague, Professor Ratna Ghoshal, will be introducing him shortly. But before you are joining in and before we begin with the lecture, let me just tell you briefly about what we are doing here at the School of Arts and Sciences at the seminar and lecture series. This series has been planned in a way so as to provide a platform for exchanging interaction, dialogues, meaningful engagement with very distinguished scholars across disciplines and across topics of interest, research, which they are currently engaging in, so that the school students of the school, faculty members, staff members, we can all engage in some meaningful dialogue with scholars around the world. And the pandemic, in a sense, has offered also us the kind of opportunity in which we could cut across these time zones and geographies to reach out to such people who are doing cutting-edge research and very distinguished research in their own field. And we have been very fortunate that we have been able to get very inspiring people for this throughout the last semester. And in this continuing with this new tradition that we have built up, I'm very pleased to invite you and welcome you for this today's talk. And before we go on to the topic and introduction of the speaker, I would like to invite the Dean of School of Arts and Sciences, Professor Patrick French, to speak a few words about the school. Patrick.
Thank you very much indeed, Sarthak, and a very warm welcome to Professor Michael Wilson of University of Minnesota, who is joining us. He looks like he's joining us from Tanzania, but that's just one of the mysteries of the times we live in, where people come from somewhere in the US and you're picturing them being in a national park in Tanzania. I have to say that really the key thing that I feel today, having listened to a fascinating seminar in the morning about Marathi vernacular literature in the early 20th century, now talking about the origin of language through the study of chimpanzees, and then the fact that tomorrow morning we have a visiting political theorist talking to us about the gendered politics of Muslim citizenship in contemporary India, that my mind is very, very full right now. But I do think it's maybe one of the few advantages of the pandemic, that we're just able to invite such remarkable scholars to come and join us, which matches very well with the fact that the School of Arts and Sciences has not only humanities and social sciences and performing and visual arts, but also a very well-established division, which is the oldest division in biological and life sciences. And I know that Ratna Ghoshal's work has very much kind of expanded into new areas, which has helped us, along with the mathematical and physical sciences division, to make sure that we really, really do span the complete liberal arts and sciences. So in that context, I will hand over to Ratna. And also just to say that it's such an interesting subject for a talk that you've chosen today on the idea of the vocal communication of chimpanzees. And I'm thinking this partly because of something I was listening to just yesterday, which is about archaeologists and how they should find the traces of non-human communities. And in fact, chimpanzees and other great apes were mentioned as like, how do you manage to keep the record of tool use going back into the archaeological record? Why is everybody so concerned with just looking for early humans? So I found that a very kind of mind-expanding idea. So welcome to Professor Wilson, and I'll now hand over to Professor Ratna Ghoshal. Thank you.
Thanks, Patrick. Thanks, Sarthak. And again, a very warm welcome to Professor Michael L. Wilson. Well, I always have called him Mike, so I'll address him as Mike. Mike is an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology and the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Behavior at the University of Minnesota, and a fellow of the Institute on the Environment. He studies non-human primates to provide comparative data for testing hypotheses about the evolution of distinctively human traits. He focuses on the behavior and ecology of chimpanzees at the Gombe National Park, Tanzania. Other work in his lab includes field studies of baboons, geladas, and bonobos, and agent-based computer models of virtual primates. So to give a little more personal angle to knowing Mike, it has been great interacting with Mike. I think we started interacting when my last year of PhD, when I was so excited after growing up reading Gerald Durrell and Jane Goodall, was always wanted to work on chimpanzees. And that's when we started interacting. We have talked about so many different projects while being in Minnesota, and I'm so glad that we are still in touch. And we hope to work on the only ape available in India, which is the Hulok gibbon. So maybe sometime in very near future. So a little bit to talk about the topic and to introduce the topic. Communication plays an integral role in animal society, including the humans. Modes of communication in animals are extremely diverse, ranging from dancing to songs to acrobatics to spraying odorous chemicals. And in today's seminar, Professor Wilson is going to talk about vocal communication in chimpanzees and will attempt to draw parallels with language evolution in humans. So I can't say the stage is all yours on this virtual platform. The screen is all yours, Mike. And just one housekeeping announcement, please leave your questions in the chat box, and towards the end of the talk, we will take up the questions. And Mike, you have around 40 minutes for your talk, right? Okay, thank you. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you so much, Ratna, and thank you for the invitation to speak here. It's very exciting to have this opportunity. I have not been to India in person, but it is a part of the world that has played important roles in people's understanding of the cultural evolution of language. When scholars in the 1700s first realized that Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin shared important similarities that could not be explained by chance, which led to the development of the hypothesis of the Indo-European language family, whereby many of the languages of India and Europe are united through shared ancestry. I won't be talking about that kind of cultural evolution of language, but it is something that is of great interest. So let me just share my screen here, and I'll go ahead and share my computer desktop because that might work out best for making it possible for you to hear the sounds that I'll be playing. So I have long been interested in the origins of human language, and in particular, what we can learn about language from studying our closest living relatives, including chimpanzees. So that's what I will talk about today, some of the recent work coming out of my lab. I want to begin with acknowledgements. Instead of leaving these to the end where we rush through them, I want to start right with them. The work that I'll be talking about today is mainly the work of my graduate students, including Nisarg Desai and Lisa O'Brien, but other graduate students who have worked with me have been involved in this project. Tony Massaro and my former graduate student Deosum Jungu is now the head of Gombe Stream Research Center. He runs the field site where this work much of the work I'll be talking about has been conducted. I also want to recognize Hashim Salala, who as a field assistant at Gombe has recorded many of the calls that we are currently analyzing. Franz Pluy, who is he conducted research on chimpanzees at Gombe in the 1970s, he has been collaborating with me over the past decade or so to build an archive of calls, including recordings that his wife made in the 1970s, Hetty van der Witplooi. And more recently, he has helped provide funding to keep our project going over the past year. I also want to thank Pavel Fedoruk and Katie Slocum, who have shared recordings of calls from Kanyawara in Kibale National Park, where I did my own PhD research, and we're building up a long-term archive from Kanyawara as well, thanks to this collaboration. I want to thank the many sources of funding that have made this work possible, especially the Jane Goodall Institute, because they keep research going at Gombe National Park and do so much to promote conservation as well of chimpanzees at Gombe and of the habitat surrounding the park. And I particularly want to thank the field teams at both Kanyawara and Gombe. It takes a lot of people to do this work, and many hard hours following chimpanzees through the forest. And without the work of these many people, none of the things I will be talking about today would be known. And I also especially want to thank Jane Goodall herself. This is the 60th year of research at Gombe National Park. Jane began working there in 1960, and she has built a collaborative team that continues to do research there. The students, current and former students in my lab, pictured here with Jane, are but a small portion of the many researchers who have been and continue to be involved in work at Gombe. So I want to thank all of these many people who have made this work possible. On to the topic of the seminar. Language is really one of the most distinctive traits that people have. It sets us apart from all other animals. And language plays such an important role in our lives that it's very difficult to think what life would be like without it and what exactly it does for us. What can we do without language? It's difficult even to imagine this. Language shapes our thinking. It helps us imagine things. It helps us imagine things more clearly when we articulate our thoughts in words. And when we communicate with others, language helps us to cooperate, and it helps us to share detailed, explicit plans with one another so that we can do things and accomplish things together that we wouldn't be able to otherwise, such as negotiating coalitions, which we can use to fight with others, or negotiating trade in order to obtain things that we wouldn't be able to get on our own. And perhaps most importantly, language provides a conduit for cumulative culture. This is an aspect of human society that makes us so different from the other animals. Instead of just learning on our own what we can learn in our own lives, our culture accumulates knowledge socially. We store and transmit the stories, knowledge, and know-how of our ancestors and distant people who we will never meet. And language makes all of these things possible. It really makes humans different from every other animal on the planet. How and why language evolved in the human lineage remains an unanswered question, or really a large set of unanswered questions. But in order to gain some understanding of our own lineage and how the distinctive traits of our own lineage evolved, we really need to study our relatives. And some of the relatives that I study and that my graduate students study are pictured here: gelada monkeys, hamadryas baboons, olive baboons, bonobos, chimpanzees and gorillas, with humans in the middle represented by a young Charles Darwin and his wife, Emma Wedgwood. I'll be focusing on chimpanzees today. These are one of our two closest living relatives, along with bonobos, which are equally related to us and equally fascinating. These species all have important things to tell us about the context of language evolution and the evolution of communication, but I'll be focusing on chimpanzees, which are of special interest because of their close evolutionary proximity to us. And maybe the thing to start with is, do chimpanzees have language? I've asserted that humans are unique in having language. What's the evidence for that? How do we know that this chimpanzee, for example, isn't actually reading the newspaper? Well, this is a long and complicated topic. Efforts have been made to teach chimpanzees language, and they can learn some elements of language, but it's really, well, it remains a controversial topic, just exactly how much of symbolic communication do chimpanzees learn, even in intensive training situations. But what I focus on is not what can we train chimpanzees to do, but what do they do naturally? I think that tells us more about how evolution works and why that helps us answer questions about why our own communication system evolved. So what can we tell about the communication of chimpanzees from their natural production? Well, chimpanzees make a lot of noise, and one of the calls that is a focus of my own research and of other people who have studied chimpanzee calls is the pant hoot. I'll play you a pant hoot now. So that's a pant hoot from Edgar, who is the alpha male of the Mitumba community at Gombe. He's the biggest and strongest and fiercest chimpanzee in that community. And here are some photos from this call that Nisarg Desai recorded with both video and audio. And there are multi-modal components to these signals. There are things going on with the face, with his hair. He's erecting his hair or puffing it out, making himself look bigger when he makes this call. He charged and slapped the ground. So there are a lot of things going on. But what I'll be focusing on today is the acoustic component of that, which we analyzing using spectrograms like this one, which show the time on the x-axis, and on the y-axis is the frequency of the call at that moment. And these calls usually contain many frequencies at once, which are shown in the darkness of the pigment, and the darker the color, the louder the amplitude at that frequency. So for example, if we look here at 25 seconds, there's a lot of acoustic energy at about 1000 hertz, and a bit at 2500 hertz, and quite a bit of acoustic energy at 4000 hertz. And it's by looking at these patterns of acoustic energy over time that we analyze these calls. Chimpanzee pant hoots consist usually of 4 distinct phases. There's an introduction, the kind of slow ooh, 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 and they're called pant hoots, by the way, because they begin with this kind of panting sound where they vocalize both while inhaling and exhaling, which is different from most human speech, where we vocalize mainly while exhaling. Chimpanzees also vocalize while inhaling, which gives that panting sound. So there's the introduction, then the buildup where the components start coming in faster, and then the climax where the hoot part of the call happens. These are higher pitched, loud portions of the call, and that's often followed by a letdown where the frequency decreases and the call kind of fades away. So this is a typical pattern of a chimpanzee call. So how can we tell if what chimpanzees are saying? How confident can we be that they are not transmitting information in the same way that I'm transmitting now as I speak? It's hard to know for sure, but we can use the tools that linguists have developed to study human speech to analyze the vocal component of the calls. And this is a little bit of my own speech that I recorded earlier this morning, quoting a passage from Charles Darwin, saying that there is grandeur in this view of life. And so I've put the approximate timing of these letters here at the top of the spectrogram. And so the top part shows where the sound is happening and when. So it basically shows the amplitude over time. And the bottom part of the spectrogram is the same sort of analysis that I just showed for the panthoots. And if we look closely at the calls, we see that there's, at the speech, we see that there are a lot of things going on. The blue line shows kind of the contour of the frequency of the call or of the speech, where here my voice raised when I said grandeur, so grandeur. But if we look closely, we can see the acoustic evidence of phonemes, which are ways of encoding little subunits of meaning into the sound or into the speech. So for example, this word grandeur is made up of a series of phonemes, each of which has a characteristic acoustic signature. And it's really quite complex what's going on. We see, for example, in the vowel portion here of grandeur, this changing in what are called the formant frequencies of, that there's one frequency down here that stays more or less the same, but a lowering frequency here in this part of the vowel, and then it rises. And it takes a fairly detailed understanding of how speech works to decode all of this, but close examination of speech signals shows that there's a lot of information in any segment of human speech. Now, if we compare this to a spectrogram of a chimpanzee panthoot, there is some complexity going on in a panthoot call. There are these different elements. These are from the hoot part of the call. And the blue line here shows some of the acoustic contour. We see the rises and falling of pitch. But one thing that stands out is if we look at these frequency bands, they're pretty much all straightforward harmonics of the fundamental frequency, that they all change in parallel. If we look within a hoot, the lower frequency here is matched by a harmonic right up here that follows exactly in parallel, and then there's another harmonic. So that this, even though it might look complex, it's really quite a fairly simple acoustic phenomenon compared to if we go back and look at the human speech pattern, where instead of just a simple set of harmonics, we see a little more complexity going on. And I can't go into all of the details here, but a kind of summary of some differences between chimpanzee vocalizations and human vocalizations is that chimpanzee vocalizations lack the detailed acoustic structure that we see that encodes human speech. And in particular, human speech has a hierarchically arranged pattern of phonemes, which are the individual speech sounds that in writing we represent with letters, which in turn are combined in syllables and then sentences. So there's a hierarchical hierarchically nested set of acoustic patterning to speech, which is really quite different from anything that anyone has been able to find in the vocalizations of chimpanzees or really any other animals. Instead, chimpanzees produce around a dozen or so distinct call types. And some people, Jane Goodall, for example, distinguishes over 30 different call types in her magnum opus, her 1986 book on patterns of behavior. Other people have reduced this to a smaller number of basic call types. But however many you choose, there are on the order of, it's an order of magnitude of dozens rather than the hundreds of thousands or millions of words that are present in any particular human language. The two kinds of calls that I will focus on today are the pant hoot, and I'll play a couple more examples just to give you a sense of the diversity of these calls. It's a pant hoot from an individual in the Kanyawara community in Uganda. Here's a different individual's pant hoot. So these calls vary individually, but the overall pattern is quite similar, even though these are Ugandan chimpanzees instead of Tanzanian chimpanzees. They both pant hoot. They also produce these calls that Peter Marler described as rough grunts, which they give in a feeding context. And I'll play a couple of these here. So that's a quiet call. I hope you were able to at least hear it a little bit. Kind of a rough grunting. And here's another variant of that category of calls, which is, again, that's quite a soft call. I don't know if you could hear it, but it sounded kind of like, whoo, 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 whoo. And so within this category of rough grunts, there are really, I think, two different kinds of calls, a low-pitched, noisier call, and a higher-pitched, more tonal call. But people have classified these together as rough grunts. There's a lot of evidence that these calls that chimpanzees give are individually distinct. And I've done playback experiments in Uganda demonstrating this. Other studies, Harold Bauer, who studied chimpanzees at Gombe in the 1970s, did studies of captive chimpanzees and found that they could match faces to pant hoot calls. So chimpanzees are able to do that easily. And Kojima and colleagues more recently found that chimpanzees can identify other individuals from their pant hoots, their pant grunts, and their screams. And if they hear a duet where two individuals are calling at the same time, they can identify both callers. So just like you and I can recognize one another by our voices, chimpanzees can as well. So what do chimpanzees use their vocalizations for? We infer the function of calls from the context in which they use them and the consequences of calling. And we don't know for sure what these calls are for in a detailed sense in many cases, but through many years of study, we can get some sense of why they give these calls. And one category of animal communication in general is advertising, letting someone else know that you're there. And chimpanzees, like other animals, advertise their individual identity. That's one thing that a pant hoot says, here I am, I'm right here. They also advertise things whether they can help it or not. Just like humans do, we provide cues of our body size when we speak, and so do other animals. Chimpanzees probably do as well. There's some information about body size encoded in our vocalizations, just because larger bodies with longer vocal tracts produce different dispersion of formant frequencies. when many individuals call together, they advertise their coalition strength. And I found in playback experiments in Uganda that chimpanzees are more willing to approach a single call from a stranger if they have many males around than if they're by themselves. So they and also I've found that chimpanzees are more, well, they're reluctant to approach many individuals calling in the distance if those individuals are strangers and potentially dangerous. Calling can advertise status. Higher ranking individuals and also males give pant-hoot calls, for example, more than low-ranking individuals. Chimpanzees also have a call called the pant-grunt, which is given specifically by lower-ranking individuals to higher-ranking individuals. It sounds something like, and they give this call when greeting a higher-ranking individual. There's a word in Swahili that plays exactly the same role. If you meet someone who's higher ranking than you, you are supposed to say shikamo, which serves the same purpose. And calls, vocalizations also serve to maintain contact with allies and associates, and many other functions. Pant-hoots in particular, because they're loud and they carry well through the forest, they're a way of maintaining contact with your friends over long distances. So some of the other functions that these calls can serve is threatening other individuals, asking for help, and warning others about predators. Chimpanzees have an acoustically distinctive alarm call that they give in response to snakes. If you hear that call, you know that someone has seen a large, dangerous snake like a python. And possibly, chimpanzees use these calls to tell other chimpanzees about food. In particular, the rough-grunt is given only when they're feeding, and they also often pant-hoot when they arrive at food sources. And so many researchers have speculated and tested hypotheses relating to this food advertising or food signaling function. So people who have studied vocal communication in chimpanzees and other animals have approached the effort in various ways. And one kind of major effort that has been led by Peter Marler, who studied vocal communication in birds and primates, and who was the first to record chimpanzee calls in the wild in the 1960s at Gombe. Peter Marler and others in his lab and others who have followed that sort of research program have looked for language parallels. What are things in the vocal communication or gestural communication of other animals that parallel features we see in language? And two parallels that researchers have been particularly interested in are evidence of vocal learning and referential signals. Vocal learning has been of interest because that is an essential part of speech, and it's something that other primates don't seem very good at. For example, when people have raised chimpanzees in human families and tried to teach them to speak, they have not been able to learn to produce human words. They certainly don't do that spontaneously. With a fair bit of effort, one American family was able to get a chimpanzee named Vicky to produce approximations of a few words, which they interpreted to mean cup and mama, and sounded like cut and something like that. But the success of chimpanzees to learn to imitate humans is really quite limited, especially when we consider that there are animals like mynah birds and parrots that are very good at vocal learning. chimpanzees don't seem very good at it. Referential signals include those, like I mentioned, where chimpanzees have a special sound used to refer to certain things in the environment, like pythons or food. And so there's been a lot of interest in referential signals as being parallel in some ways to words. The evidence for vocal learning in chimpanzees, as I mentioned, is slight. They're not good at imitating human speech. They don't really do that spontaneously, and they never get very good at it, even if you try to get them to learn. But John Matani, when he was a postdoc working with Peter Marler, he recorded calls, the panthoot calls of chimpanzees at Mahale Mountains in Tanzania, and compared them with recordings that Peter Marler had obtained at Gombe in the 1960s. And they published a paper where they reported the existence of chimpanzee dialects, which were thought to be parallel to the dialects reported for birdsong by Peter Marler and others, who found that songbirds in many species have regional variation like the dialects of speech. So they found that there were some differences between these calls. In particular, at Mahale, the build-up portion of the call, which we can see at the beginning of these spectrograms, was a bit faster than at Gombe, where we have longer units in the build-up. And the climax, the hoot part of the call, was higher in frequency. But within a couple of years, Matani was already publishing papers with alternative explanations, such as differences in body size. The Mahale males have bigger bodies than the Gombe males. They may have evolved adaptations, acoustic adaptations to the forest structure. So these could be biological differences for transmitting calls more effectively in their particular habitat, rather than cultural differences or learned differences. Another possibility is that the calls that Peter Marler recorded were recorded at the feeding station where Goodall fed chimpanzees bananas. So maybe that had something to do with the structure of the calls. But other people have sought to replicate this study at other sites. And Kathy Crockford and colleagues found evidence for dialects in 3 geographically contiguous social groups at Thai Forest in Cote d'Ivoire, West Africa. And in their study, they controlled for genetic relatedness in the context of the call, and they found that these calls were statistically different. But again, the differences are quite subtle, and in contrast to the human languages spoken in these different parts of Africa, which are quite different indeed, the chimpanzee panthoots are acoustically quite similar, even in these different subspecies living thousands of kilometers apart. So I have been working with my graduate students and collaborators to assess this vocal learning evidence, which doing so in a thorough way is challenging. To really know if chimpanzees are learning, we need longitudinal data, so data collected over many years to see if there's evidence for transmission of specific features in the calls of individuals from one generation to the next. And we need a larger sample of calls from neighboring communities than what these earlier studies provided. So I've been working with colleagues to compile a comprehensive archive of vocalizations from Gombe and also Kanyawara. Just to show you where these are, Gombe is in Tanzania, just south of Burundi, across the lake from the Democratic Republic of Congo. And Kibale is also close to Congo in Western Uganda. So Kibale is where I did my doctoral dissertation research. And then since starting as a postdoc at Minnesota in 2001, I've been working at Gombe. I spent 3.5 years there full time as the director of field research. And these are some of the people who've helped build the archive. Hetty van der Wit-Plooi recorded calls in the 1970s. Charlotte Uhlenbrock recorded calls in the 1990s. My graduate student Lisa O'Brien recorded calls at Gombe in the 2012-2013 period. And then Hashim Salala has been working with Nisarg Desai to record calls more recently. The calls I'm talking about today were recorded 2016 to 2017. Hashim has been out there recording calls this year as well with funds provided by Frans Plooi, who is Hetty van der Wit-Plooi's husband. Hetty passed away a few years ago, but Frans Plooi has been working to make sure that her calls have been archived and available for research. So here is Nisarg in the field with some of the chimpanzees at Gombe. So what have we found? This is the number of calls per individual that we have from Kanyawara, where we have recordings provided by Pavel Fedoruk and Katie Slocum. And then at Kasakela, we have calls from two neighboring communities at Gombe, the Kasakela community and the Matumba community. At these sites, the alpha male, Edgar at Matumba, produces more calls than anyone else. That's fairly typical. But we have enough calls from each individual to warrant acoustic analysis where we have some confidence in the statistics. What we see, looking at things lots of different ways, Nisarg sent me about 30 different images. I'm not going to show them all to you today from his recent analysis, but they all look kind of like this, which is basically there's a lot of variation, but no clear variation among communities. So there's a lot of variation within individuals and between individuals, but no clear community signal. We see this also with drumming. This is a feature that when chimpanzees call, sometimes they will hit or kick the buttress of a tree to make a big resounding drum. And in addition to analyzing vocal features, Nisarg analyzed the number of drum beats per panthoot call. And it looks like Kasakela chimpanzees tended to call a bit more, or tended to drum more often than others, but there's a lot of variation and no clear community differences that were statistically significant there. And looking at things using a principal components analysis, which is a statistical method for identifying patterns among many different variables in an effort to find differences among groups, we see that there is just a lot of overlap in these in the calls of Kasakela in green, Matumba in blue, Kanyawara in red. There's really no differentiation in their calls. So in terms of evidence for vocal learning, there's no evidence for dialects at Gombe. And even the Gombe calls aren't really very different from the Kanyawara calls. So it seems that these calls are more likely to signal individual identity rather than group membership. So going on from vocal learning to referential signaling, this has been of great interest because these pairing of acoustic structure to features of the environment like snakes or food seems word-like. And what I'll focus on here is some work by my graduate student Lisa O'Brien, who has examined these food-associated rough-grunts to see if chimpanzees invite others to share their food. These are spectrograms of rough-grunts from a paper by Katie Slocum and Klaus Zuberbuehler, and they reported that these different acoustic features related to different preference levels, so that low frequency calls related to low preference, and these higher frequency, more tonal calls with more harmonic structure were associated with foods that they preferred more. And they did a playback experiment with a captive chimpanzee, where they played calls from in the captive enclosure in a setting where there was a pair of artificial trees, one that normally had apples in it and one that had bread in it. And when they discovered apples or bread, the chimpanzees produced different acoustic structures in their rough grunts. They seemed to prefer bread more than apples, and so gave the higher pitched, more tonal call to bread. And the individual in this study, when apple calls were played, he tended to search the tree that had apples, that normally had apples, and if they played a bread call, he would search the bread tree. And so this, they reported, was evidence of kind of word-like referentiality, that the acoustic structure matched the, or paired with the preference level of the different food items. But when they attempted to see whether this was also the case for chimpanzees in the wild at Budongo Forest in Uganda, they found that there were no acoustic differences for the top 3 wild food species. Research at Tai Forest in West Africa has found some evidence for acoustic differences for one of the top 5, for one of these 5 different species. So the higher pitched call is given more to one food type than these others. So currently the evidence is kind of mixed for whether rough grunts serve a referential role in the wild. And so Lisa spent 11 months at Gombe collecting data to see if she could find evidence for this. And what she found was that there are distinct calls, there are high-pitched and low-pitched calls, but when you plot the peak frequency of calls within feeding bouts, there's just a lot of variation. It's not that they gave high-pitched calls to resin and low-pitched calls to flowers consistently. There's a lot of variation within these. We see, for example, with leaves, there's high-pitched calls given to leaves, low-pitched calls given to leaves, high-pitched calls given to fruit, low-pitched calls given to fruit. There's a lot of variation between these high peak and low peak frequency calls. And Within-Bout, there's a lot of temporal variation. So here's the peak frequency of calls, and then each bout is color-coded here and scaled to the same time, looking at the proportion of the elapsed feeding bout. And we see that there's really there's a lot of different kinds of calls given within the feeding bout. And looking at the data lots of different ways leads to basically the same results here, that there is acoustic evidence for these at least 2 different kinds of calls within this rough grunt category. But instead of referring to highly preferred and less preferred food or specific types of food, the Within-Bout variation often encompasses the entire frequency range. So they're not giving high-pitched calls to highly preferred foods, low-pitched calls to low preferred foods. And the frequency does not vary reliably over the time in the patch. So what then is the function of rough grunts? And Clay and Zuberbuehler have argued that the referentiality is somehow based on sequence composition, that there's some kind of word-like patterning going on. But I think the balance of evidence is really mounting that social factors are more important than food properties. Individuals are more likely to call when they're with others than when they're alone, more likely to call in the presence of higher ranking individuals, more likely to call in the presence of important social partners, and in the presence of females with full sexual swellings. So these calls aren't acting in a word-like way to say, I've got nice food here. Instead, they are playing some sort of role that has to do with social context. And what Lisa has argued in her work really follows from suggestions by Oren and Rendell that we should move past referentiality, that the idea of referentiality in as a language parallel is really more metaphorical, but it often is taken literal as people attempt to analyze these calls. And if we instead take a stance of trying to understand vocal communication from the standpoint of the animals, rather than trying to impose some kind of language parallels on them, we're more likely to understand how and why these calls evolved and what function they actually play in animal societies. So in the remaining minutes that I have, I want to talk a little bit about why language is rare and really unique to humans. And there are a few reasons for why this might be. One is maybe because we just have really big brains, that language is rare because sufficiently large brains are rare. Now, if we look across mammals, we see that there are other animals with brains that are as big or even bigger than human brains. So we have the human brain here, which is smaller than the elephant brain or the brains of some dolphins and whales. But controlling for body size, humans do have really big brains. And that probably has something to do, or quite a lot to do, with having language. Compared to other primates, humans have large brains. Our brains are about 3 times the mass of chimpanzee brains and are considerably larger than what you would expect based on our body size. Looking across primates, there are there's evidence for variation in intelligence based on these different measures of things that primates do, like using stone tools to pound open nuts and so on. And we see that if we use this primate G-score to compare the apparent intelligence of different primates, chimpanzees, which are in the genus Pan, have a high G-score. So they are pretty clever compared to other primates. That has something to do with the relatively large brains of chimpanzees. So chimpanzees have big brains. They're clever compared to other primates, but they don't have language. Is that mainly because that their brain still isn't big enough or they're not clever enough? I'm inclined not to think so, that it's not just a matter of brain size, but instead has to do with social structure. And I think this because the closest parallel to language, and you might hear some other animal communication in the background here as my cat is complaining that I'm not giving her a second breakfast. The closest parallel to symbolic communication in humans is not really with chimpanzees, it's with the honeybee. And I think this relates to the nature of social behavior and selfishness. So most animal signals are basically selfish signals, and they involve fraud and deceit and manipulation. And for symbolic communication to evolve, there needs to be honest signaling so that both the sender and the receiver agree on the matching between signal and symbol, which raises questions about how honest cooperative signaling can evolve in nature. And just to give a little more theoretical background to this, traditionally in animal communication, researchers assumed that animals communicate to share information and that signals evolve for the good of the species. And so people viewed courtship signals and food calls and alarm calls all as basically altruistic signals and signals that honestly signal emotional state for some group level benefit. But Richard Dawkins and Krebs, following up on the selfish gene view of evolution, argued that communication really has more to do with manipulation. Because animals are designed by natural selection to replicate their genes, they rarely share anything unless doing so benefits themselves and or their kin. And so animals should produce signals in order to benefit themselves and their kin. And because of this, most animal signals are not particularly honest, except in this species, Apis mellifera, the honeybee. And like other bees in this genus, the honeybee produces a symbolic, or arguably symbolic communication pattern, the waggle communication, which in the waggle dance, honeybees go back to the hive after they've been out foraging or looking for some resource that's important to the hive, like water or a new nest location. And the worker bee comes back to the hive, and she goes to the comb, and she starts walking around on the surface of the honeycomb in this figure-8 form. And she walks around in a counterclockwise way, and then she waggles for a while in one direction, and then she walks in a clockwise fashion, and then waggles again. And the orientation of that waggling and the duration of the waggling provides a vector, a distance and direction to the resource of interest. And human researchers here at Minnesota and other places videotape the waggle dances of bees and use them to infer the locations where bees have been foraging, and they can decode them. This is a relatively precise signal that bees decode and that human researchers can decode in order to gain information about the world. Bees have tiny little brains, and yet they have communication that is arguably symbolic. So why do they have this dance language? Why is it bees and not chimpanzees that can give a precise vector to a food resource? So in honeybees, the hive is basically a large family. They depend on cooperative foraging in order to ensure their reproductive success by getting food for themselves, their hive members, and the hive's offspring. So the hive is basically one big family, the queen and her daughters and a few of her sons. The worker bees are sterile, and their only route to reproductive success depends on rearing sisters, including future queens. That's how they will have, how they will replicate the genes that are in their own bodies, is through raising sisters. So all hive members have a shared interest in finding and gathering food. And so that promotes the evolution of honest signaling. And we see honest signals in other social insects like ants, which leave a scent trail between food resources and the nest. But bees can't leave a scent trail because they fly to their food resources. And so they have evolved the waggle dance to transmit basically the same sort of information about the location of food. So how are humans like bees? Well, we're unlike bees in that our social groups contain many non-kin. A recent analysis by Kim Hill and colleagues found that in human hunter-gatherers, present-day hunter-gatherers, the residential groups turn out to be not particularly closely related to one another. It's very different from honeybees. However, we are like honeybees in that our survival depends on successful group foraging. In human hunter-gatherers, men go out hunting, women go out gathering, and they bring food back to share with each other. And also, success in foraging in humans depends on cumulative cultural knowledge, how to make tools, how to extract hidden and protected foods, and how to process foods safely so that they can be consumed. Every human society requires extensive cumulative cultural knowledge in order to feed successfully. And so we resemble honeybees in that honest communication about foraging practices is necessary for our survival. And our means of transmitting this information is largely through language. So to conclude, symbolic communication, and specifically language, is really one of the key transitions in the history of life. It's a big deal. Humans are really different because of language. And symbolic communication, there are really only two clear cases of it having evolved. One is in the genus Apis of bees, and the other is in the hominin lineage. And symbolic communication appears to be rare because selection usually favors selfish and dishonest communication. And this, I think, more than brain size, is why chimpanzees don't honestly signal to one another information about food quality. In contrast, in bees and in hominins, unusual circumstances have shifted the balance in favor of honest communication. So that is all I have in my presentation for today. I'm happy to take questions if there's time to do so now.
Sure. Thank you, Mike. I have quite a few questions in the chat box, but before I move on to those questions, I have one question to ask, and let me ask that first, and then I move on to the chat box question. So chimpanzees do hunt for meat, right? That's like a specialized food for them. So does the rough-grunt or any kind of call differ with meat hunting, because that's like a more prized possession? And also I am not sure how much cooperation they need from other group members, so how much group foraging is involved. So then it becomes an honest signal or chances of having a collective share of information. Yeah, so.
Right, those are great questions. The rough-grunt doesn't seem to be given in a meat eating context. Chimpanzees vocalize a lot when they're hunting and sharing meat, and there are lots of different calls given. But you may have noticed from the figure showing the context of rough grunts from Lisa O'Brien's work, none of those occurred during meat eating bouts. So it just seems to be such a different social context that they're not giving rough grunts in that context. There is at least Jamatani reports that there is a specific call that chimpanzees in the Ngogo community in Uganda give when they're starting to look for monkeys to hunt. And so that's a call that I don't know if chimpanzees at Gombe give that call. It's not something I've noticed in my observations, or that Goodall or others have reported from Gombe. So that might be an Ngogo specific thing, or maybe we just haven't been paying the right kinds of attention to get that. Hunting in chimpanzees is more successful when more individuals participate. The extent to which it is cooperative is a topic of vigorous debate within chimpanzee researchers. But there is a kind of a benefit from having other individuals around when a hunt occurs. But it's also the case that when they're hunting, they can see each other. They don't have to tell each other, I'm gonna hunt, with a vocal signal, except maybe that call that they give when they're starting a hunting patrol. Once they see monkeys, it's obvious what's happening. They communicate non-verbally on what they're gonna do.
Okay. So going into the questions that I have in the chat box, there is a question from Clarita Mendes, and she is asking that whether there is learning period for vocal calls in chimpanzees as it is in songbirds.
So that's a really good question. In songbirds, there's this period of plasticity where they are able to learn. They need to learn their species typical call during that time. Humans are similar in that languages we learn as young children. We can have a native speaker accent if we learn a language before puberty, and if we learn languages later in life, it's very difficult to acquire a native speaker accent in that language. In chimpanzees, the vocalizations seem to come pretty much hardwired. They don't seem to need much learning. And in fact, in the first home rearing experiment that was done of a chimpanzee in the Yerkes group in the 1930s, the family doing the experiment discontinued it because their son was learning to vocalize like a chimpanzee. So that the chimpanzee wasn't learning human calls, it was naturally producing chimpanzee calls without any exposure to chimpanzees, and their child was imitating those chimpanzee calls.
Okay. Okay, so the other question that I have is from Ashok Singhvi. Have you examined the response to recorded chimpanzee voice with frequency modulation introduced in them? And also he's asking, is their response instantaneous or is it delayed?
So that's a really good question. The playback experiments that I did were the first ones that were conducted successfully with chimpanzees in the wild, and they're hard to do. And so the ones that I did in Uganda were really very simple. We just played a single stranger's pant hoot call, and then immediately, packed up the equipment and hit it so that chimpanzees wouldn't see what we were doing. And since working in Uganda, I've been based in Tanzania at Gombe, where we haven't been able to get permission to do playback experiments. There's concern that they could affect chimpanzee behavior. People at other sites, especially Budongo Forest in Uganda, have done a lot of playback experiments since then. But I'm not aware of any that have really modulated the frequency of calls to see what effect that would have.
Okay. I have another question, and that's from the human perspective more so. There's a student, Muskan Arora. She's asking, autistic people are said to be honest in their communication, all sorts of communication, and often find it difficult to understand allistic people's hidden intentions and lies and pranks, etc. Can we connect this to animals like chimpanzees and honeybees somehow?
That is a super interesting question. And that's one I haven't really thought about before. So I'm not sure how to respond. The psychology of autism is usually described as a deficit in theory of mind and perspective taking. So I think the difficulty that autistic people have in understanding dishonesty has to do with difficulty in imagining other minds. They know what is true themselves, and so it's hard for them to imagine somebody saying something that isn't true. The dishonesty in animal signals and the manipulation and so on, I think differs from the sort of dishonesty we think of in humans, in that it's usually not intentional. It's the sort of dishonesty of a viceroy butterfly that looks just like a monarch butterfly. Monarch butterflies are toxic, they taste bad to birds. Viceroy butterflies have evolved to look just like monarch butterflies, so birds are less likely to eat them. But the viceroy doesn't have any intention of being dishonest. I think that's the way most animal signals are. The animals don't, intend to be dishonest. They just signal the way that they've been evolved to signal.
Right. So then I also have a question from my friend and colleague, Manjari. I will unmute her and she can directly ask the question. Yes, Manjari, you are unmuted. You can ask. Can you, is your audio working? No, I can't hear you. So yeah, you may ask now. Okay, I think she's having some audio trouble. So I'll ask on her behalf. So she asked that chimpanzee calls are referential, but do they have syntactic structure as seen in some other non-human primates?
Right. So syntax is an interesting area of research, and Kathy Crockford, who has studied chimpanzee vocal communication at Thai Forest and Budongo Forest, I saw her give a talk last year in which she argued that these different elements of chimpanzee calls may vary in ways that are meaningful or that may vary among sites. She noted that most of the names we have for chimpanzee calls reflect that they have multiple parts, like pant, hoot, pant, grunt, bark, pant, bark, and so on. So there are these multiple parts of chimpanzee calls, and she has proposed that maybe it matters how those different parts are arranged in a way that would be similar to the arrangement of words or syllables in human speech. I think that's an interesting idea, and but I'm not aware of really solid evidence yet that there's meaningful variation in syntactic structure in chimpanzee calls.
Okay, thanks. I have another question from a student, Yashendu. He's asking that, are there any recorded cases where female chimpanzees learned a new dialect as they leave their maternal group when they attain sexual maturity? Because he has read that they tend to adopt habits of the new group, especially the foraging habits.
That's right. The studies at TAI by Lydia Luntz have found that females adopt the foraging habits, the tool use patterns of the community that they immigrate into. Female vocalizations are hard to study in chimpanzees because they're quieter than males. They don't produce pant hoots nearly as often as males, and really the whole subject of female vocal communication in chimpanzees has been neglected. There have been very few papers on the calls of females. And in terms of pant hoots, I don't know of any study of that would tell us whether they learn to pant hoot differently when they move from one community to another. Maybe eventually I think even at Gombe, we try to record calls from every individual, including females, but the sample for females is just really small for pant hoots.
Okay, I still do have a lot of questions, but Sarthak, maybe you can ask some questions you had received.
Yeah. Thank you. So I have a couple of questions from some faculty colleagues here. Amol Agarwal, Professor Amol Agarwal is asking this, that of course it was a fantastic talk and very exciting. For first timers, what is a good book to begin reading and following this line of research? Also, when and how did humans break away from chimpanzee communication and evolve their own?
Right. Yeah, those are both great questions. I think the book I would recommend for this topic is the main textbook that I've been using in. Sorry.
It is getting lost in the woods.
If I hold it against me, you can see it. So The Evolution of Language by Tecumseh Fitch is an excellent book that covers the evolution of language. So I would recommend it. I'm using it in a course I'm teaching this semester. Also, How Monkeys See the World by Dorothy Cheney and Robert Seyfarth is a classic book on efforts to understand vervet monkey communication and referential signaling. And they're beautiful writers. It's a really good book. The question of how humans separated from chimpanzees, or from how we both separated from our common ancestors, has, I think, a lot to do with feeding ecology and changes in the forest structure in the late Miocene and Pleistocene as the global climate cooled with the coming of the ice ages. Africa became drier and the forests became less abundant. And the ancestors of chimpanzees, for the most part, stayed in the forests. Whereas and even where chimpanzees live in savanna forest mosaics, they exploit food from the trees. They stay close to the trees. Whereas in the ancestors of humans spread into new habitats and learned how to acquire foods from these dry areas, especially using tools, digging sticks to dig up roots, stones to smash hidden and protected foods. And these cultural techniques to acquire new foods, I think, were really central to the ability of human ancestors to exploit these new habitats and eventually led us down the path of collective foraging and honest signaling about foraging methods and food locations.
So I have another question from a faculty colleague, and then I also have one more question of my own. But I'll ask the question from my colleague first. So Supratim Dasgupta is asking that is language only a medium of communication? Can the difference between human and chimpanzee language be attributed to only vowel sounds versus vowel and consonant sounds? When and why did humans start developing a script? So this is a different thing from the language. And then there is a very interesting question about do chimpanzees also protest? So are there any recordings or something like, are there any protest calls?
So lots of great questions there. I might go backwards and take the easiest questions first. In terms of protesting, chimpanzees do have screams and wah barks, which have a protest-like function. A scream protests someone attacking you. They scream in response to that. And the wah barks are kind of a comment on other individuals fighting and maybe do something to signal coalition support. In terms of the origin of scripts, we know that the writing evolved independently several times in human history. It evolved independently in Mesoamerica among the Mayans, and in Africa among the Egyptians, in Mesopotamia, in the civilizations that used cuneiform, and in China with the writing system that's still used in China. There's also the writing system of the Mohenjo-Daro civilization of the Indus Valley is, I think it's unclear whether that's an independent origin or is related somehow to the Mesopotamian writing systems. The scripts currently used in India descend eventually from Egyptian hieroglyphs through Phoenician letters. But that's all recently in the past 5,000 years that scripts have evolved. These questions of whether language has to do just with communication or serves other purposes, I think it's, well, Terry Deacon has argued in his book, The Symbolic Species, that language and brain have co-evolved in humans, and that a major function of language is not just communicating, but has to do with symbolic thinking. And that these things have evolved together, that as the brain has become more symbolic, it has become powerful and more able to use language, and there's a feedback with that. It's clear that we use language extensively in our thinking when we kind of talk to ourselves silently, and helps to organize our thoughts. I think the remaining question had to do with whether consonants are important in chimpanzee vocalizations as well as vowels. Yeah. And I think it's harder to distinguish between consonants and vowels in chimpanzee calls than in human speech, because human speech is organized in terms of phonemes, which can be distinguished between consonants and vowels, and words and sentences. And chimpanzee calls don't really seem to have these distinct phonemes. It doesn't seem to have that structure of consonants and vowels the way that human speech does.
So, I mean, if I can just ask my question. So, thank you so much for this fascinating lecture, and this is really a very, I mean, very, very good lecture. So, I mean, you touched upon with some few very important aspects about the development of language and development of why the need to communicate. Right? I mean, as you explained that the need for collective foraging and survival, increasing survival chances, and so in a sense, you are also saying that the altruistic motive of communication or the honest signaling is a very important part. I was just wondering that we also know that there are certain parts of the brains which perform certain functions, and so if this is also related somewhere to some part of the brain being used, which is actually getting involved in the altruism part or the altruistic signal or the honest signaling, in that sense. Because to me as a layperson, even the calls for alarm calls would be a kind of an altruistic signaling in that sense. So then if there are alarm calls, why did it not go on to form that kind of a language or coded that kind of a, why did it not evolve from there and just remain at that particular moment in time? So that is what my question is. And then another question also, I mean, similar to this, about this collective group behavior, actually very interesting. And I think I think I was also this is particularly also related to maybe Ratna's work also about elephants. And we know that elephants also have kind of group behavior, and there is also this idea that they mourn collectively. And we have seen reports recently also, there were some incidences in which these kind of behaviors, we got a glimpse of how elephants can collectively mourn. So I was just wondering that, are there some kind of voice signaling uh, to which strengthen these kind of group behavior in species which are other than primates, like say an elephant? Because you also mentioned the size of the elephant brain as becoming as being large compared to others, right? So these
Yeah.
two.
So lots of great questions in there. That you're talking about altruism reminds me that while we've been talking, my daughter brought down some breakfast for me, which is a food sharing activity, which is I think evidence of altruism and other regarding and cooking, all of things that are so important in human societies. And there are definitely different parts of the brain that are associated with uh, specifically with language, and then various parts of the brain that are associated with altruism. And other animals do engage in acts that are um, arguably altruistic. So we see um, lots of examples of group level behavior, and there's vigorous debate within the different research communities about just how exactly altruistic these signals are. So for example, with alarm calls, um, in a sense they seem very altruistic. Like when I remember one occasion when I was in the forest in Gombe, and I was sitting with Mzee Hilali, who was one of the long-term field researchers, and in the distance we heard a call that was unfamiliar to me. And Hilali turned to me and said, "Chatu," or nyoka. He said, that there was a python or a snake. And I I couldn't figure out what he was saying at first. That how did he know there was a snake? And then the chimpanzees that we were watching got up and left, and Hilali went and followed them. And eventually I made my way over to where Hilali was, and he motioned for me to come over, and I sat down next to him. And then he pointed in front of him where about 2 meters away from us, there was an enormous python that was curled up in the bushes. And in the trees surrounding us were the chimpanzees, who were all standing up in the trees, or in the trees looking at the python. And they were all intensely interested in the python. And after a long time, they gradually came down one by one, and they walked as close as they dared to the python. And I remember them walking slowly as they approached the python, and then they'd kind of race past once they they got closer than they could really be. So why do chimpanzees tell each other that there's a python around? This is, researchers at Budongo have done some interesting studies looking at this, where they've presented artificial snakes to chimpanzees, and there have been some interesting experiments with bonobos as well, presenting snakes and getting different responses based on social context. But I think one thing that people have found with alarm calls is that so alarm calls are given by lots of different species. So for example, in ground squirrels, they have, just like in vervet monkeys, they have distinct alarm calls for terrestrial versus avian predators. And they found that the social context matters, so that individuals are more likely to call when their kin are close by. And so it's altruistic only in the kin selection sense. They're not incurring a cost at the expense of their inclusive fitness. They're benefiting their inclusive fitness by warning their kin that there's danger nearby. And alarm calls can also serve, they can be selfish in a way that we see, for example, there's a behavior called stotting that some antelopes and gazelles in Africa perform when they see a predator. And instead of running away from the predator, they do this stereotyped kind of bouncing, which looks really absurd. Why would you do that when there's a predator nearby? And biologists have argued that what they're doing is signaling to the predator that they have all kinds of energy reserves and speed, and don't even try hunting me, because I am just super fast. I'm so fast that I can stot. And so similarly, alarm calls, vocal alarm calls, can let the predator know that you see the predator. Now, snakes are deaf, so they can't hear if chimpanzees are alarm calling at them, but they are ambush predators. So once you've seen the snake, it's probably not going to try to catch you. And I've come across pythons, surprisingly. We've surprised each other, and that's a pretty exciting thing to experience, because they can rear up to an enormous extent, and they're big animals and they can eat people. But once they've seen you, and once you've seen them, they just lie there. You can go right up to the python and take its picture, and they tire out easily. They just lie there. So I think alarm calling about snakes, in chimpanzees, it's probably a kin benefit kind of thing, that you don't want your kids to get eaten, and so you alarm call so that your kin don't suffer.
Actually, that also is seen in, because Sarthak got the elephant connection, I really wanted to add that Katie Payne's work on playback on African elephants have also showed that most of the time the group elephants are the ones who react to the playback of predator calls, and not so much if there is like a solitary bull. And even there is a difference when the bull is in a sexually active musk stage versus not so active. So when in a sexually active stage, the bull really does not care. So the response even towards a predator call is even reduced there. So yeah, so kin benefit is something that's also been noticed in other animal groups. Yeah, with this, I just have one more. I have a lot more questions. I'm sorry, guys. Maybe I can just forward these questions to Mike. But I have a question from Ashwin, our faculty colleague, and I'll ask that question, and that may be the last question. Isn't the syntax the real differentiator between language and other communication systems? And if so, is it possible to search for evidence of syntax in animal communication?
So that's a great question. And I think one of the things that Tecumseh Fitch does so nicely in his language evolution book is detail the many different ways in which language differs from other forms of animal communication. So some people like Noam Chomsky focus on syntax. Other people focus on other aspects or features of language, like its symbolic meaning. But syntax is clearly an important part of it. And biologists in animal communication have made efforts to study syntax in primates and birds especially. And in and perhaps this is relevant to whale communication as well. I think there's some evidence for, well, there certainly have been claims that there are associations between syntax and meaning in non-human primate vocalizations, and Klaus Zuberbuehler has done work along those lines. And I guess I'm not fully persuaded about at least what I've seen for the primates. I think it's intriguing in terms of thinking about early stages of differentiation between completely stereotyped calls and calls where the order of the elements matters. So I think it's an interesting area to explore further. But there doesn't seem to be any non-human species that uses the ordering of elements in a the kind of combinatorial way that humans do. That really seems to be uniquely human.
Okay, well, thanks a lot, Mike, and really thank you for doing such an early morning session with us. And with this, I'll hand over to Sarthak to give the formal vote of thanks. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ratna. And it was really indeed a very great pleasure to have you. And thank you so much, Professor Wilson, for this fascinating talk. I think, now, since we have been communicating so much during the pandemic also, but somehow, the need for, from different mediums of communication have also perhaps come out and surface, like Zoom being one of them. But I think this is very interesting because we went back to the origins and the need, and again, what are the motives of communication and other things. So it was very great to listen to this talk, and I think we will be really happy if you can visit India later on when we get back to normalcy. And definitely we will be indeed very pleased to welcome you in person at Ahmedabad University also, so that our students and faculty members can talk to you and engage in more meaningful discussion. So thank you so much, Professor Wilson, for today's lecture. And I would also like to take this opportunity to thank all the participants who attended this webinar. It is because of all of you and your continued, your continued interest and enthusiasm that we have been able to roll out the seminar and lecture series at the School of Arts and Sciences this semester with such consistency and with so many interesting speakers who have been coming here. And we also have more interesting speakers who will be coming in the next semester. So we would really be, appreciating your continued support and your, regular attendance for these events that we plan out here. And with on behalf of all my colleagues at the School of Arts and Sciences, I would like to thank all of you. Thank you.